It started as just another evening, one of those gatherings Emily had become so fond of hosting. The kind where our home filled with laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, and the hum of conversations I wasn't part of. I'd grown used to these nights. Emily called them her way of unwinding. A chance to spend time with friends from work. Jason Turner, her coworker, had quickly become a regular at these gatherings. He was the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately owned it, his confidence and charm drawing everyone in. People loved Jason. Emily certainly did. I told myself it was harmless. Sure, he stood too close to her when they talked, his hand sometimes lingering on her arm a second too long. Sure, his laugh was a little too loud when she made a joke, and his compliments came a little too easily. But I dismissed it. They were co-workers, friends. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was imagining the unease twisting in my gut every time I saw them together. But that night, the unease finally took shape. The evening started like all the others. Emily moved through the room with effortless grace, laughing with her friends and topping off glasses with wine. Jason was right there beside her, as usual, flashing his perfect smile and charming everyone within earshot. I stood on the edge of it all, holding a beer I didn't really want and nodding along to conversations I wasn't really part of. I didn't mind being in the background. I never had. Emily was the social one, the extrovert, the star of the show. I was content to support her, to let her shine. But something about that night felt different, off. At one point, I caught Jason watching her, the kind of look that lingered just a moment too long. I turned away, shaking off the thought. Don't overthink it, I told myself. Don't be that guy. But the moment that shattered everything came later, after the drinks had flowed freely, and the room was buzzing with the kind of laughter that only comes after people have had one too many. I was standing near the kitchen, half listening to a story Jason was telling, when Emily's voice rang out. Oh, come on, Daniel, lighten up. I turned to see her grinning, a glass of water in her hand. Don't look so serious, she added, and before I could respond, she tipped the glass forward. The water splashed over my head, soaking my hair and shirt. The room erupted in laughter. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The cold water trickled down my neck, but it was the laughter that stung the most. Emily was doubled over, tears in her eyes from laughing so hard. Jason clapped a hand on her shoulder, laughing along with the rest of them. It wasn't the water that broke me. It was the way they looked at me, like I was the punchline of a joke they'd been telling for years. I felt my face flush, a mix of humiliation and anger boiling inside me. But instead of reacting, I turned and walked to the kitchen, leaving the laughter behind. In the quiet of the kitchen, I grabbed a towel and dried my face. My hands were trembling, though whether from anger or something else, I couldn't tell. I leaned against the counter, staring at the sink, trying to steady my breathing. It wasn't just about the water. It wasn't even about the laughter. It was about what it represented. Emily and I used to be a team. We used to respect each other, value each other. But somewhere along the way that had changed. I didn't know when it started. Maybe it was gradual, little moments I didn't notice at first. Or maybe it had always been there, simmering under the surface, waiting for a night like this to finally spill over. The truth hit me like a weight in my chest. I wasn't just a bystander at these parties. I was a bystander in my own marriage. I thought about the way Jason looked at her, the way her laugh seemed a little brighter when he was around. I thought about the way she brushed me off earlier in the evening when I tried to join a conversation. Her smile polite but dismissive. And now, I thought about the glass of water, the laughter, and the way she hadn't even noticed the humiliation on my face. This wasn't about a single moment. This was about years of being overlooked, dismissed, and taken for granted. I set the towel down and straightened up, a quiet resolve settling over me. The humiliation ended here. I walked back into the living room, where the party was still in full swing. Emily barely glanced at me, too engrossed in a conversation with Jason and another coworker. I stayed on the edge of the room, observing, my mind racing with thoughts I hadn't allowed myself to entertain before. I'd spent years convincing myself that things would get better, that Emily and I were just going through a rough patch. But now, As I watched her laugh and glow in Jason's orbit, I realized I'd been lying to myself. Something had to change. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to keep playing the role of the quiet, invisible husband. I deserved better. For the rest of the night, I stayed quiet, watching, waiting. The laughter and noise faded into the background as my resolve grew stronger. By the time the last guest left and the house fell silent, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about respect. Respect I had lost for myself and respect I needed to demand from Emily. As I climbed into bed that night, Emily already asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself, "This ends now." That night, after the party, sleep didn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Emily breathing softly beside me. The events of the evening playing over and over in my mind like a cruel highlight reel. The splash of water, the laughter, the way Jason's grin lingered just a little too long as he watched me retreat to the kitchen. It was all burned into my memory. But the water wasn't the real problem. It wasn't even Jason. It was the way Emily had laughed. The way she'd looked at me. Not as her husband, but as someone beneath her. Someone whose feelings didn't matter. That hurt more than anything. I turned onto my side, studying her sleeping face in the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. How had it come to this? How had the woman I once loved so fiercely, who used to look at me with so much warmth, become this stranger who mocked me in front of her friends? I thought about Jason, how often he was at these gatherings now, how his presence seemed to light her up in a way I hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't just Jason. It was her friends, too. They encouraged her, laughed along with her, enabling the little jabs and dismissive comments she threw my way. This wasn't just about a bad night. It was a pattern, one I could no longer ignore. By morning, my chest felt heavy with the weight of everything I'd been holding in. I needed to talk to someone. Someone who would listen without judgment. Someone who could give me a fresh perspective. That's when I called Ethan. Ethan and I had been friends for years, ever since we worked together at a summer camp in college. He was a paramedic now, the kind of guy who thrived in high-pressure situations. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. We met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where you could sit for hours without anyone bothering you. Ethan was already there when I arrived, a steaming mug in his hand and his familiar steady presence grounding me as soon as I walked in. "Rough night?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You could say that," I muttered, sliding into the seat. For the next hour, I laid it all out. The party, the glass of water, the laughter, and the growing distance between Emily and me. I told him about Jason, about how Emily seemed to light up around him in a way she never did with me anymore. I admitted how small I'd felt in that moment, standing there with water dripping down my face while everyone laughed. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. He just listened, his expression a mix of concern and quiet anger on my behalf. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. "That's a hell of a situation," he said finally. "Tell me about it," I muttered, staring into my coffee. "Look," he said, leaning forward again, "you've got every right to be angry. What she did, what she's been doing, it's not okay. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" I shook my head. "I don't know. If I confront her, she'll just twist it, make it seem like I'm overreacting. She always does." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then don't confront her. Not directly, at least. Let her actions speak for themselves. If she's crossing lines, people will notice. And if they don't, you make sure they do. Sometimes the best way to handle someone like that is to let them dig their own grave." His words hit me like a jolt. I hadn't thought about it that way before, but he was right. Emily had been dismissing my feelings for years, twisting the narrative to make herself the victim whenever I tried to call her out. If I confronted her now, it would be no different. But if I let her actions speak for themselves, if I quietly stepped back and let the truth come to light naturally, that could change everything. We spent the next hour brainstorming. Ethan, ever the practical thinker, helped me come up with a plan. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and making sure Emily couldn't continue to dismiss me without consequences. "You don't have to do anything drastic," Ethan said as we stood to leave. "Just start paying attention. Be patient. People like her always slip up eventually." For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control returning to me as I drove home. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had a direction. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Emily was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, her feet tucked under her on the couch. She looked up as I entered, her expression neutral. "Hey," she said, her tone casual, as if nothing had happened the night before. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I didn't bring up the party. I didn't bring up Jason or the water or the laughter. Instead, I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table, my mind quietly working through the plan Ethan and I had crafted. Emily might not see it yet, but the dynamic in our marriage had shifted. I wasn't going to be the passive bystander anymore. As I sat there, listening to the faint sound of her scrolling through her phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. This wasn't just about ending the humiliation. It was about taking back my life. The morning after my conversation with Ethan, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The humiliation from the party still stung, but it had sharpened into something else: determination. I wasn't going to let that night define me. Emily's behavior had gone unchecked for too long, and I was done ignoring the signs. I started paying closer attention, noticing patterns I'd overlooked in the haze of denial. Her sudden increase in spending was the first clue. A new dress here, a pricey handbag there. It wasn't out of the ordinary for Emily to indulge, but lately, it had become more frequent. The receipts in her purse told a story she hadn't bothered to share with me. Her work meetings were another red flag. They always seemed to align with Jason's schedule. I'd hear her mention him in passing, brushing it off as professional. But the timing was too perfect, too consistent. And then there was her phone always buzzing late at night. She'd keep it face down on the counter, her fingers darting across the screen with a practiced ease. If I glanced her way, she'd put it down quickly, her smile forced as she changed the subject. The cracks in our marriage had been there for years, but now they felt like gaping holes. That's when I decided to call Sarah Harper. Ethan had mentioned her during our conversation, describing her as sharp, discreet, and relentless. She was a private investigator who'd seen it all and wasn't afraid to dig deep. If anyone could confirm what I was beginning to suspect, it was her. When we met at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, Sarah struck me as someone who didn't waste time. She had a no-nonsense demeanor, her eyes sharp and calculating as she listened to me lay out the situation. "You want proof," she said, more a statement than a question. "Yes," I replied. "I need to know what's really going on. And not just with Emily, Jason too." Sarah nodded, her pen moving quickly across a notepad. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." It didn't take long. Within 2 weeks, Sarah uncovered more than I was prepared for. Emily and Jason had been meeting in secret for months. Their rendezvous ranged from quiet lunches to late-night visits at his place, each one more damning than the last. Sarah's photos and timestamps painted a picture of a relationship far beyond what Emily had ever admitted. But it wasn't just emotional. Emily had been helping Jason financially. Bank statements showed transfers to an account in his name, small amounts at first, but they grew larger over time. Seeing the evidence laid out in front of me was like a punch to the gut. I had suspected, but having proof made it real. "She's invested in him," Sarah said during our follow-up meeting. "Emotionally and financially. That kind of connection doesn't happen overnight." Her words hung in the air as I stared at the folder in front of me, my stomach twisting. As painful as the truth was, it also brought clarity. This wasn't just about Emily and Jason. It was about the people who had enabled her behavior, the ones who had laughed at her jokes, cheered her on, and turned a blind eye to the damage she was causing. Chloe, her best friend, was the worst of them. She had always been outspoken, the kind of person who thrived on drama and loved to stir the pot. Whenever Emily made a snide comment or dismissed me in front of others, Chloe was the first to laugh or egg her on. Brian, on the other hand, was the silent enabler. He never said much, but his lack of confrontation spoke volumes. He was there at every party, watching from the sidelines, never once stepping in to call out the obvious. They weren't just complicit, they were part of the problem. I started refining my plan, determined to expose not only Emily and Jason but the entire web of hypocrisy that had allowed this to continue. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and making it clear that I wasn't the passive bystander they all thought I was. I began gathering my own evidence to supplement Sarah's findings. I kept track of Emily's spending, noting the dates and amounts that coincided with her visits to Jason. I observed her interactions with Chloe and Brian, noting how their conversations often veered toward justifying or excusing behavior that should have been indefensible. Piece by piece, I was assembling a puzzle that would show the full scope of what had been happening behind my back. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life again. The power dynamic was shifting, and I was no longer the one left in the dark. As I sat at the kitchen table one evening, reviewing Sarah's latest report, Emily walked in, her phone in hand. She barely glanced at me, her focus on the screen as she typed out a message. "Big plans for the weekend?" I asked casually, my tone neutral. She looked up, startled by the question. "Just the usual," she said, her smile tight. "Why?" "Just curious," I replied, closing the folder and standing up. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, suspicion flickering across her face. But she didn't press further. As she left the room, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. She didn't know it yet, but the game was about to change. The truth was no longer something I feared. It was something I was ready to confront head-on. The moment I decided to act, it felt like a weight had lifted from my chest. I wasn't waiting anymore, wasn't passively hoping things would change. The truth was in my hands now, and it was time to use it. The first step was Jason. He was the linchpin, the smooth-talking, self-assured coworker who had seamlessly inserted himself into Emily's life and our marriage. His charm had carried him far, but I suspected there was more beneath the surface, cracks in the facade that no one had bothered to explore. Thanks to Sarah Harper, the private investigator, I had what I needed to pull those cracks wide open. Among the documents she provided were details of Jason's business dealings, a few questionable contracts, some creative accounting, and a trail of small but significant discrepancies that suggested he wasn't as spotless as he pretended to be. I packaged the evidence carefully, ensuring it was clear, concise, and anonymous. My target? A local journalist, another Sarah Harper, coincidentally enough, who had built her reputation on exposing corruption and unethical practices in the business world. When I mailed the package, I included a simple note: "If you dig deeper, you'll find more." It didn't take long for the first ripples to appear. Within days, whispers about Jason's business practices began circulating. Sarah Harper, the journalist, published a preliminary article highlighting a few of his questionable deals, framing them as part of a larger investigation. Jason, as expected, denied everything. But denial only went so far. His clients and colleagues began asking questions, the kind of questions he couldn't easily answer. At the same time, I turned my attention to Emily's inner circle, the enablers who had stood by and encouraged her behavior for years. Chloe was first. She loved drama, thrived on stirring the pot, but she also had a tendency to overshare. I'd overheard her bragging at a party about bending workplace rules to secure a promotion, dropping names and details like she was untouchable. Using a burner email account, I sent an anonymous tip to her HR department. I didn't embellish, I didn't need to. The truth was enough. Within a week, Chloe was called into a meeting with her supervisor. She kept her job, but the investigation left her shaken and on thin ice. Then there was Brian. He wasn't malicious like Chloe, but his silence had made him complicit. For years he'd quietly stood by, never calling out Emily's behavior or anyone else's. But I also knew something about Brian that most people didn't: his struggle with alcohol. It wasn't a secret to me. At gatherings, I'd noticed how his glass was always full, how he'd slip away when he thought no one was looking to refill it again and again. It wasn't my place to expose him publicly, but I decided to nudge him toward help. Using the same burner email, I contacted Brian's wife, framing it as a concerned note from an anonymous friend. I told her I'd noticed his drinking had gotten worse and suggested she gently encourage him to seek help. To my surprise, it worked. Brian started attending meetings and cut back on his socializing, creating more distance between himself and Emily's circle. Watching these small actions ripple through their group was deeply satisfying. Chloe's bravado dimmed, Brian distanced himself, and Jason's reputation began to crumble. The once tight circle that had enabled Emily's behavior was starting to show its cracks. But this was just the beginning. I turned my focus to the upcoming gathering at Jason's house, a place where Emily and her enablers had often thrived in their arrogance. It was the perfect stage for the next part of my plan. Jason had planned a casual evening with the usual crowd, an event Emily had mentioned in passing with the same detached ease she always used when she wanted to avoid my questions. "I'll be late," she'd said, scrolling through her phone. "Jason's hosting something small after work. Nothing fancy." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Sounds fun." She didn't notice the edge in my tone, too absorbed in her screen to realize I was already one step ahead of her. In the days leading up to the gathering, I worked quietly, ensuring every detail was in place. I refined my evidence, organizing it into a clear narrative that would be impossible for Emily to twist. This wasn't just about her and Jason anymore. It was about the entire group, their hypocrisy, and the way they had enabled and excused behavior that should have been called out long ago. I wasn't walking into this confrontation blind. I was prepared, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was in control. As the evening approached, I could feel the tension building, a mix of anticipation and determination. This was my chance to reclaim my narrative, to expose the truth and force Emily and her enablers to face the consequences of their actions. By the time I arrived at Jason's house, I was ready. The air was crisp that evening as I pulled up to Jason's house, parking a few blocks away to keep my arrival under the radar. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. This wasn't a moment I'd stumbled into. It was one I'd meticulously planned. As I approached the front door, I could already hear the familiar sounds of laughter and chatter spilling out onto the quiet street. Inside, Jason's circle thrived on their usual blend of arrogance and self-assurance. But tonight, things would be different. I pushed open the door without knocking, stepping into the house uninvited. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and an uneasy ripple passed through the room as people registered my presence. Emily's laugh died mid-sentence when she spotted me, her eyes narrowing in confusion and then alarm. Jason, standing at the center of the room with his signature glass of whiskey in hand, tensed but quickly composed himself. "Daniel," he said smoothly, his grin tight and forced, "didn't know you were joining us tonight." "Neither did I replied evenly, letting my eyes sweep over the group. But I figured it was time I stopped sitting on the sidelines. The room was silent now, all eyes on me. Emily stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice clipped. I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I turned to the group, my tone calm and steady. "I won't take much of your time. I just thought it was important that everyone here knows the kind of people they're surrounding themselves with." Jason's grin faltered slightly, his eyes darting to Emily for a split second before returning to me. "What are you talking about?" he asked, the confidence in his voice thinning. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," I said, "is a detailed account of Jason's fraudulent business practices. False contracts, creative accounting, money that mysteriously disappears. It's all here." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room like wildfire. Jason's face hardened, his charm slipping as the first crack in his facade appeared. "That's ridiculous," he said, forcing a laugh. "You can't seriously expect anyone to believe this." I opened the folder, pulling out the first document. "This," I said, holding it up, "is a contract Jason falsified last year. Here's the original, and here's the altered version he submitted to his client. Funny how the numbers don't match." Isn't it? I handed the document to the nearest person, a colleague of Jason's who immediately started reading it, his face darkening with every line. And here, I continued, pulling out another page, is proof of a bank transfer from one of Jason's clients to an untraceable account, an account that just so happens to be in Jason's name. The tension in the room was palpable now. Jason's smooth exterior had all but shattered, his face red as he tried to regain control. "This is a joke," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't have any idea what you're talking about." Emily tried to step in, her voice high and tight. "Daniel, stop this. You're making a fool of yourself." "No, Emily," I said firmly, cutting her off. "For years, I've let you and your friends treat me like I didn't matter, like my feelings didn't exist. But tonight we're going to talk about the truth, about Jason, about you, and about the choices you've all made." Her face paled, and for the first time she had no response. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence, and my heart leapt. Right on cue, Ethan stepped into the room, his presence calm but commanding. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his eyes scanning the stunned faces. "I thought I'd join in. Seems like quite the gathering." Jason glared at him. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the guy who reported your financial practices to the authorities," Ethan replied smoothly, crossing his arms. "Consider this your heads up. You might want to get your story straight before they come knocking." The room erupted into chaos. People were whispering furiously, some edging away from Jason as though his guilt might be contagious. Jason turned to Emily, his voice desperate. "Did you know about this? Did you tell him anything?" Emily's face was frozen in a mask of shock, her eyes darting between me, Jason, and the group. I didn't," she stammered, but the weight of the evidence around her left her floundering. I stepped back, letting the scene unfold. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about them, their lies, and their crumbling facades. I didn't wait to see how it ended. I had done what I came to do. As I walked toward the door, I glanced back at Emily one last time. Her eyes met mine, wide with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't dwell on it. Whatever she was feeling, it wasn't enough to change what had happened, or what I had to do. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting me like a breath of freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one on the receiving end of humiliation. The truth was out, and it was up to them to deal with the fallout. As I walked to my car, a sense of closure settled over me. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free. The fallout began almost immediately after Jason's party, spreading like wildfire through professional circles and social networks. Sarah Harper's article hit the headlines just days later, laying bare Jason's fraudulent dealings with meticulous detail. Every questionable contract, every untraceable transaction, every piece of damning evidence was there for the world to see. Jason's once pristine reputation crumbled overnight. Clients pulled out of deals, colleagues distanced themselves, and the whispers that had started at the party turned into public condemnation. He tried to deny it at first, releasing a statement about misunderstandings and malicious attacks. But the evidence was too overwhelming. By the end of the week, Jason was effectively a pariah. Emily's social circle didn't fare much better. Chloe, ever the opportunist, was quick to distance herself from the chaos. She made no effort to defend Emily, instead focusing on damage control at her job after the HR investigation I'd initiated put her on thin ice. Brian, quietly battling his own struggles, faded away without a word. He stopped attending gatherings and became a ghost in their once lively group chat. And Emily? She was left isolated. The confident woman who had once thrived in Jason's orbit, now standing alone in the wreckage. The first time she reached out to me was through a text. "Can we talk? I had no idea about Jason." "I'm so sorry." I didn't reply. The second time, she called, her voice shaky and full of emotion. "Daniel, please. I didn't know he was like that. I was stupid to trust him. I see that now. But we can fix this. Please, just talk to me." I let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "I think you've mistaken my silence for forgiveness, Emily," I said evenly. "But there's nothing left to fix. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them." The call ended there, leaving her with the same emptiness she had once made me feel. While Emily grappled with the consequences of her actions, I focused on rebuilding my life. For years, our home had felt like a space where I didn't belong, a place filled with her influence and the shadows of our failing marriage. Now it was time to reclaim it. I started small, clearing out the things that no longer served me. The decorations Emily had chosen, the photos that felt like relics of a life that wasn't mine anymore. All of it went. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and brought in pieces that reflected who I was, not who I had tried to be for her. The house began to feel lighter, freer. It became a space where I could breathe, where I could finally feel at peace. Reconnecting with old friends was another step in the process. Ethan, who had been my anchor through the chaos, became a constant presence in my life. We'd meet for coffee, go on weekend hikes, and talk about everything and nothing. Through him, I realized how much I'd let myself shrink in my marriage, how much I'd sacrificed to keep the peace and avoid conflict. That version of me was gone now, replaced by someone who understood his worth and refused to settle for less. The clarity and confidence that had once eluded me now guided my every decision. I started pursuing hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside: photography, woodworking, even a community cooking class that felt oddly therapeutic. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. Emily's apologies continued sporadically, but they held no weight. Each one was a reminder of the toxic environment I had left behind and the choices she had made that led to her isolation. I didn't hate her. I didn't have the energy for that anymore. I simply didn't care. One evening, as I sat on the back porch of my newly transformed home, the sun setting over the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The chaos of the past months had finally settled, leaving me with a life that felt like mine again. Emily and Jason were chapters one had closed, lessons I had learned. The scars they left would fade, but the strength I had gained would stay. I wasn't the same man who had stood in the kitchen that night, humiliated by a glass of water and the laughter of people who didn't see me. I was someone stronger, wiser, and finally free. And as the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh beginnings, I smiled to myself, knowing that the best parts of my story were still to come. The weeks turned into months, and the shadows of my past slowly faded into the background. With Emily and Jason behind me, I finally felt like I was living a life of my own design. The weight that had once sat heavy on my chest, the constant questioning of my worth, the quiet humiliation was gone. I threw myself into my work, no longer distracted by the turmoil at home. The focus paid off. My manager noticed my renewed drive, and within a few months, I earned a promotion that had felt out of reach for years. It wasn't just about the title or the pay. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, that I could excel without the drag of toxic relationships holding me back. Rebuilding my social life was more challenging. For years, I had let Emily's world dictate mine, limiting my connections to people who often saw me as an afterthought. Now I had to start fresh, and I approached it cautiously. I began by reconnecting with Rachel, one of Emily's former friends. Rachel had distanced herself from Emily long before everything fell apart, and I hadn't seen her in years. She reached out after hearing about the fallout, offering kind words and a listening ear. "You've been through hell, Daniel," she said over coffee one afternoon. "But I have to say, you seem lighter now." I smiled, realizing she was right. It feels like I've finally stopped carrying something I didn't even know I was holding. It was through Rachel that I met Olivia. Olivia was the kind of person who immediately made you feel at ease. She was kind without being overly saccharine, genuine without trying too hard. Our introduction was casual, a simple dinner Rachel hosted with a few friends, but Olivia stood out to me immediately. Our first conversation was about books, of all things, an old, shared favorite that sparked an easy back and forth. Talking to her was refreshing. There was no pretense, no underlying tension, just two people enjoying each other's company. Over the next few weeks, we stayed in touch, meeting for coffee and discovering more shared interests. Olivia was patient with me, understanding that I was still finding my footing after everything I'd been through. There was no pressure, no rush, just the steady, comforting rhythm of something new. By the time the seasons began to change, I found myself thinking about Emily and Jason less and less. They were part of a closed chapter, a story I no longer needed to revisit. The transformation of my home was complete, each room now a reflection of who I had become. It was no longer the house where I had felt small and unseen. It was a sanctuary, a place filled with warmth and potential. One evening, as I stood on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The future was mine to shape now, free from the chaos and betrayal that had once defined my life. I didn't know where my connection with Olivia might lead, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. As the breeze carried the scent of autumn through the air, I smiled to myself. The pain I had endured had shaped me, but it didn't define me. The possibilities ahead were endless, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace them with open arms. This was my new beginning, and I wasn't looking back.